Good evening. Still a few people drifted in, but we'll let them catch up. Thank you for coming tonight. I'm Jack Messer. I'm the Director of Planning and Development Services for the City of Overland Park. And we're here this evening as an outgrowth of the city's Forward OP effort, and in particular, a goal that we identified titled Living. And as part of that goal, there are a variety of possibilities that we need to explore and continue talking about. But in particular, one of the actions that we identified was to convene conferences on the topic of maintaining vibrant suburbs. So that's kind of our effort tonight. And tonight is really an opportunity to start a learning process. And so that's what we're here to do tonight. You may have heard that in Overland Park we build 5,000 plus square foot single family homes and apartment complexes. That's pretty much what we build. And so one of the questions might be, how do we build different types of housing, and can we explore that, and would that be something that Overland Park could do? So one of the ways that we got here during Forward OP, I personally moderated a stakeholder group of young professionals that was put together by the chamber. These were lawyers, accountants, engineers, young, good-paying jobs that work in Overland Park. And they said to me, the conclusion of that stakeholder group, they said, listen, we can work in Overland Park, but we can't afford to live here. And so that's a pretty sobering question from a room full of bright individuals that I think sums up one of the questions that we have in front of us. And along the way, we've engaged with a group called the Incremental Development Alliance, and tonight they join us to help us kick off this experience. They sum up what they do by saying that they train rookie developers and coach cities to help unlock small-scale development. So that's what they're going to talk about tonight. I asked Matthew earlier how he wanted me to introduce him, and he said Matthew Petty. So I'm going to go a little bit further, but tonight Matthew Petty is joining us. He's a planner, he's a developer, and he's a city council member in Fayetteville, Arkansas. And Jennifer Settle is his colleague. She joins us. She's an urban designer and a recovering form-based code addict, and she lives in the Chicago suburbs. So she joins us. They're helping kick us off, and tonight Matthew is going to take us through a conversation about small-scale development. So Matthew Petty.
Good evening. Good evening, and thanks for having us tonight. Of course, this is an important topic in a lot of communities. It's a real hard one, right? And thank you for taking your night to come and talk about one of the sexiest topics there is, housing. At least I think so, and I know you think so if you're here as well. So Jennifer and I work with a nonprofit called the Incremental Development Alliance, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what we mean by incremental development here in a minute. What we do is, we help people take control of their own community's futures. There's a lot of people that walk around or drive around your own neighborhoods and they say, somebody ought to do something with that empty piece of land or with that vacant storefront. And we think that if you're somebody who says that maybe you are the person who ought to do something with that vacant piece of land or that empty storefront. And we want to give you the skills to do it. So we do these workshops where we teach people who maybe have never done development, or maybe they've executed a project before, maybe they're only ever going to do one project, or maybe they have aspirations to make a career out of it. We teach them soup to nuts how to get started with real estate development. We don't teach them a formula for success. We teach people that developers go bankrupt, and so can you. But we do teach them an approach, and we do teach them that as long as they're willing to not give up and ask the right questions and meet the right people and learn the right skill sets, that they can make their communities better. We don't believe that there's a cavalry coming in from out of state or out of town to enact your own community's vision. chances are people who come from out of state or out of town look at your plans and they say something like, well, that's really adorable, but let me tell you what's actually going to work. And that's a story that we hear often in a lot of communities, but we actually think that communities, if they take the right approach, can actually see those plans implemented. So that's why we're here in Overland Park. The other thing we do, and what we're doing here, is we try to help cities build an ecosystem to allow small-scale development to occur. And so that's really what I want to talk about tonight, is what is small-scale development, and why is it so important and overlooked. This is a diagram we use to talk about kind of what our common conceptions are about real estate development. We're all really familiar, if you can see this, with this pattern of single-family subdivisions. We see it everywhere we go all across the country. Of course, we see it here in Overland Park as well. It feels very familiar to us. We're very comfortable with this pattern. We also see a lot of this larger scale development. And even though we might be real familiar with it, most of us aren't so comfortable with it, are we? In fact, there's something about this that makes us decidedly uncomfortable. And a lot of us have this idea when we start to see this kind of 4 to 5 story kind of cookie cutter mixed use or apartment program start to take shape, we start to think that we're all going to end up something like a skyscraper city, that we're just going to Manhattanize from here to here. Well, that's not true. It's not true that you automatically become Manhattan. You have to have a lot of other things going on in your community for you to make the jump from here to here. That's the first misconception that we get wrong about real estate development generally. But there's a more important misconception. It's this middle missing part of the graph. There's something between all this. There's something between the scale of a subdivision and single-family development and the scale of the giant apartment complex. We see it in our oldest neighborhoods. We see it in our downtowns. We see it in the places that we visit around the country. In fact, we probably visit those places because they have things besides only single-family subdivisions or large-scale apartment complexes. There's something magical about that middle scale that we want to talk about and that we think would benefit Overland Park and that you talk about in Forward OP. So that's what we're here to talk about, is incremental development. What we mean by incremental development is if you're going to build something and there's demand for it in your community, start with just the next highest step. Don't leapfrog from your single-family subdivisions up to your largest scales that are possible in the market. Try it out first. And if that works, tweak the rules and maybe try out the next step and see if that works. Move a little bit more slowly. Adapt over time. So we're talking about stuff that's generally 3 stories or less. We say 0 to 3 stories because in a lot of markets we work in, you can't justify even building a building. You might be able to justify rehabilitating a building, but in some markets you can't even do that. Now, Overland Park isn't a market where you have to test the waters with a food truck or a street market, but that is the principle of what we're talking about. There's an approach here. If you can't afford to build anything, what's the next highest step? Maybe it's a tent and a food truck, right? And maybe you use that to test the market and acquire the financial data and so on and so forth that you need to go to get a loan to do a brick and mortar building. And so there's this idea of the next step. We're also talking about stuff that's almost entirely residential. Not exclusively residential, but this is important for us to talk about because most of us don't realize what our towns are made of. Go out tonight on your drive home or on your drive into work tomorrow and just start counting the buildings you see. Just start making a little note, little tally marks. 90% of the buildings in Overland Park and in every community are residential. And most of us don't even realize it. Economic development agencies spend their time chasing the next most sexy project that they can think of or that comes in the door. And it's not that those projects are necessarily bad for your community, but they're inherently risky. And they also might not be precisely what is in the highest demand. There's a saying in economic development that retail follows rooftops. And it's absolutely true that downtowns follow housing, that new mixed-use development or corridor development follows those rooftops just like anything else. The kind of development that we're talking about is inherently community-oriented. Now, there's nothing wrong with returning home after a hard day of work to your sanctuary and not being bothered. I don't like to pick up the phone or answer the doorbell as much as any other young person these days. But there's also something really special about these neighborhoods that we cherish, that are filled with this middle scale of development. People there know each other. They rely on one another for things whenever they need somebody. There's something about this scale of development that builds community in the way that a single-family subdivision or an apartment complex doesn't. There's something inherently isolating about those formats and something that is more connecting about the middle scale. I want to paint an example, and we're going to get into some more case studies in just a second. Here on the screen you see two donut shops. They're both basically the same. They both mastered the art of frying dough, and putting sugar on it, and making crappy coffee. They're essentially the same business. And even though these projects are on the same size site, they're very much different in terms of their economics, both in the way they get started and in what they return to the community. We know the story of franchises versus local businesses, and there's a parallel that plays out with the development itself. This site allows for multiple businesses, and each one of these structures has a residential unit in the back where the owners of these businesses lived while they were getting started and then used for supplemental income whenever they'd made it. You don't get that with something like this. You don't get it at all. That's on top of the benefits or the drawbacks of having to be a franchise. When we talk about incremental development, we're really talking about this lower left-hand quadrant. And I love this slide because I'm a consultant, and consultants live by these kinds of 2x2 matrices. You can't have a good PowerPoint presentation without having a 2x2 graphic like this, so I hope you all appreciate it as much as I do. The industry is focused in the top right, and it makes sense. There's a lot of money to be deployed, and the outfits are big. There are big teams that are trying to do these projects, which means you have to achieve a scale that justifies the work. That means you're master planning something, and if you're master planning something, you're going to use big corporate institutional funds. You're going to use big debt, big capital. It doesn't make any sense to try and use big capital to do things one step at a time. You know, big money isn't patient enough for that kind of approach. That's the top left quadrant. It also doesn't make any sense to master plan something all the way to the end so you know what it's going to look like when you're finally finished and then just try to bootstrap the money together. Nobody works on those two quadrants. The kinds of opportunities we're talking about are kinds that you might not even realize are there. They're small. They're the side lot that's attached to the existing house. They're the parking lot that is a little bit underutilized for the business that is doing well. They're places that until you have a little bit of experience or you've seen an example of this kind of small parcel redevelopment work somewhere, you might not even recognize it as an opportunity. Now, I've been to Overland Park maybe a half dozen times, mostly driving through. I've pulled off the interstate to drive through downtown 3 or 4 times now. Today we spent more time on a dedicated tour. And I can't think of a street that we were on that I didn't see at least half a dozen development opportunities. And we probably drove 30 miles of streets. Now, I'm a developer, though. I'm trained to see those kinds of opportunities. It doesn't mean that those opportunities are real. Okay, it means that they're technically feasible with respect to what's on the ground, but there's probably still zoning and development codes to deal with, lenders to deal with, and so on and so forth. Even though I can see it and I can see that it's simple, it doesn't mean that it's easy or that it's possible today, but it does mean that you have a value proposition for your community if you can identify those and start allowing people to take advantage of it. That mode of development is a lot different than the way the industry works. I talked to you a little bit just a second ago on my favorite 2x2 slide about how the industry is driven by this economy of scale, right? If my banker tells me that the cost of getting a loan document developed and approved is going to be $15,000. I can afford to do that if I have 200 apartment units. I can spread that cost across every unit. It's a very low per unit cost. If I'm building 4 units and my banker tells me that the cost of my loan is $15,000, I might not be able to afford it anymore. So small-scale development is driven by an economy of means. What can I get done today with the opportunities that I have right now? It's a very different kind of thing. And it's not normal. We don't think about doing what you can with what you already have very much in our society these days. That's the opposite of the way we think about life and business in general. We're all driven and taught from a very early age to glorify the big scale. But it comes with some inherent problems and drawbacks that we'll get into. The other thing about the industry is that you have to specialize to succeed. You know, like if you're not just a broker, you're a commercial broker. You're not just a commercial broker for any kind of commercial business, you're a commercial broker that only does storage units. You're not just a broker who only does storage units, you're a broker who only does storage units that are client controlled, that are at least 3-story talls and have blue doors instead of orange doors. I mean, that's how specialized the industry is. I only do apartments if they're occupied for senior living. Small-scale development is different. You have to be a generalist. I can't afford to hire a team of land use lawyers to argue with the city. I can't afford to hire the best architecture and engineering team in the county to go talk to the neighborhood and convince them that what I'm going to bring is advantageous. There's a whole set of things that I would normally hire out if I was a big outfit that I just can't afford to do, so I have to figure out how to do it on my own. So you have to be a generalist to be a small-scale developer. That also means if you work at a city or at a bank or somebody else who has to work with developers, that when a small-scale person walks in and they don't seem like they know what they're doing, that's normal, because they don't, because they can't, because they have to do all of it. It means it's even more critical that they get some help along the way. We're going to talk more about how the regulations, or there's kind of a patchwork of regulations in the end, so I'm going to kind of gloss over that. But suffice it to say that there's at least 12 different languages you have to learn to do development well. The banker talks a different language, the zoning administrator talks another language. They might use the same words and they've got different definitions in the building code. Then I have to talk to my appraisers. I have to talk to my inspectors. I mean, the list just goes on and on and on. Which, again, if you're a large outfit, you can afford to hire a representative to deal with all that. That's how you solve it. How do you solve it if you're a small outfit? You don't. You give up. A small developer will not even pick up the phone to call the city and ask a question if they read your rules and the rules say that what they want to do is not allowed, or even worse, if it's not easy. Big outfit has the time to do hard things. As a small developer, I don't. And last, this idea about citizen opposition. I hear that in Overland Park there is a little bit of citizen opposition about proposals that come in once in a while. I've been a council member for almost 11 years in Fayetteville, so I've been to my fair share of public hearings. I've facilitated dozens and dozens of meetings. Some were more heated than others. Our longest council session ever lasted 13 hours. There's only been one of those. It's only been one ever. Thank you. It's really normal, I think, maybe you think it too, I think it's really normal for people to be afraid of what's going to happen in their neighborhood if a giant project gets approved. I don't care what it looks like. It is so normal. Especially if that project comes in and it looks unlike anything they've ever seen before. You know, if a developer walks in and they might say this is going to be unlike anything you've ever seen before and it's part of the sales pitch. You know, how does that feel if you want more of what you already got? Small-scale development has a relative competitive advantage to the large-scale stuff because I can go in and I can say, listen, I'm going to build like what's down the road. What do you think about that? We might make a couple of changes to it. but it's basically going to be the same. Instead of 5 stories next to your 1-story house, we're talking about doing something that fits in. So it's a different conversation, right? It's a lot different than the way the industry typically works. And I spent a lot of time belaboring this point because developers have kind of got a bad rap. They kind of earned it, right? I think a lot of developers visit a community and they have this idea that they're bringing something the community really needs, and so in their heads they're kind of like Gandhi freeing his people. But really they're, to the community, it's kind of like Darth Vader. And there they are trying to use the Force and do the Jedi mind trick on the whole neighborhood. You look around your community, though, and almost all of it was built by somebody who was doing development. The state of the industry is a lot different than it used to be. And there's something about getting back to that. That's why we talk about how the cavalry is not going to come in from out of state or out of town to do what you want. You have to figure out how to do that. And that means small-scale stuff, just like your community was built originally. Downtown on Metcalf wasn't done as a master plan downtown. It was done very incrementally. It was done with the beginning of a crossroads, and then the next step, and then the next step, and added up for 100 years or 40 years or however long, and you get something different, something that's much different, vibrant, something that's way greater than the sum of any of its individual buildings. This is a big part of the industry today, right? Affordable housing. And I know that one of the reasons we're here is because in Forward OP there was a recognition, and we started the conversation with this tonight, there was a recognition that Overland Park is not affordable to some people. So we're not talking about this explicitly. We've made a decision, a conscious decision, not to talk very much about affordable housing. That says capital A, affordable housing. That's different than lowercase a affordable housing, and this is a little bit contrived, but what we mean by that is the kind of a housing that is affordable to the people you know. Not the kind of housing that is affordable via subsidy to the people who are on their hardest luck. Those programs are really important. We believe in those programs. We believe in the kinds of programs that I'm showing up here, but they're not replicable and they're not scalable. It will take you 18 months of work behind a desk to get funding for a project like this. You've got to have cash flow the whole time, which means you need to be a big outfit. It's heavily subsidized. The subsidies are limited, probably coming from the state with some kind of a competitive grant-making program. If you're good at this and you're able to do one and prove that you're good at it, sure, you can make a career of doing these. You can make a career of doing one of these every 18 months. I don't think 500 units every 18 months addresses your challenge. It's like putting a Band-Aid on a wound that you need to have stitches for. It's got a place, but it's only a small piece of the portfolio of solutions that you have to use to address your challenge. So we talk about lowercase a affordable housing. And when we talk about that, we talk primarily about housing options and making sure that a variety of housing is available to people. So yes, we're talking about small-scale multifamily projects. We're talking about how to figure those out and make those appropriate for the right places in Overland Park. Now, I know multifamily is a big bad word. It's a 4-letter word in a lot of communities. We're not talking about giant apartment complexes. We're talking about that middle scale that we've forgotten about. So I always like to ask this question. This is a show of hands moment. How many people would choose today to take on a roommate and live in an apartment? That's what I thought. How many people have had to do that in their lives at least once? That's what I thought. There's a whole different conversation. It's about what our community needs. Right? And what our community needs, what Overland Park needs, according to Forward OP, is a little bit more diversity in your housing stock. Only single-family homes and only mega apartment complexes don't cut it. That's a failure. It's a long-term failure. You got to crack the code on this middle scale of development. This series of statements is so simple to make. It almost feels a little simple to talk about this. But we put this up here for inspiration. When you look at any particular neighborhood, every neighborhood needs to have this kind of stuff. Every one of these is a market opportunity for a small-scale developer. A real opportunity. An opportunity that will pay somebody's income to keep their spouse and their kids fed for the next 6 months. An opportunity that will bring tax revenue to the city every year forever if you can just get it across the line. How many opportunities do you have to do a 300-unit apartment complex? I know there are more of them, but that is a set of tracks that has an end, that runs out. You cannot assemble a 50-acre parcel forever. There's not an infinite number of those. So we have to think about how can we fit in things with what we've already got. And usually that means acknowledging this and asking what's missing. Every single one of those is a development opportunity. Not just a development opportunity, but an opportunity to make the lives of the people in that place better. So let's talk a little bit about that. I like to put things in terms of numbers because, I think there are a lot of values and a lot of personal beliefs associated with the kinds of things we're talking about. When we're talking about housing, when we're talking about what our neighborhoods should look like, what our communities should feel like, it's very personal for us. For a lot of us, it's even deeply spiritual, right? It gets that deep. But the numbers are pretty agnostic to all that stuff, and they tell a really clear story. Punchlines first, that's my policy. Punchline is you can actually plan, just like a business can create a business model that tells what the revenue is going to be if they do things right. You can actually plan what the revenues are going to be like in a city. And I don't just mean year to year, I mean long term. You can actually look at a development and you can predict how much revenue is going to come out of it into the tax coffers every single year going forward forever. You can actually do that. It's actually not that hard. But most cities don't do it. And I get it. Okay, math is hard. Yeah, we all know that. Math is hard. So is life. Deal with it. Let's look at some of the math. This is a typical block. This is a smaller block than a lot of the blocks in Overland Park. I know that, but if you use your imagination, bear with me. I think we can get to the same point. All this stuff around the block has expenses associated with it. Pavement has to be milled and overlaid. The utilities, regardless of who's in control, whether it's a city or a third party, the utilities have to be upgraded and maintained. This has a school district associated with it that has to be funded. This has parkland associated with it that's used to make it worth living there for the residents. All that has to be funded. The trash has to be picked up. All that has to be funded. All those trucks have to be replaced on the schedule. All this has expenses associated with it, right? This is City Management 101. All this has revenue associated with it. And we can actually look at neighborhoods and we can assess how much revenue is going to come out of it. In fact, that's a job in every single county in the nation. That's the county assessor's job. There's a science to studying where revenue comes from and how much revenue is going to come from a particular development pattern. And different patterns have different revenues. Some have a lot more and some have a lot less. Some have more expenses and some have less expenses. Small things can add up. If this is a neighborhood with no porches and a third of the parcels are vacant, adding one new house to that street might inspire somebody else to add another house to that street. Adding one new porch to that street or one fresh coat of paint might inspire somebody else. That's new revenue coming into the city. That's not just a better looking street. That's more revenue that comes in. And sometimes it can be quite significant. It might only be $500 for a porch job on one of these houses, but 500 times 20 houses equals the potholes being filled. Equals the part of the sidewalk where the tree roots have uplifted the sidewalk, having that repaired. It equals having the truck come around once a week instead of once every 2 weeks to pick up the trash. It equals having the animal control officer being there on time when you report a concern. Right? Revenue goes places. I have a list in Fayetteville, Arkansas that is longer than this room, probably stretches all the way back to City Hall, of projects that I could fund it if I could just get $20,000. That's not a lot of money in city terms. It's only a couple of blocks of modest improvements, maybe not even that much. As a council member, and probably for most planners or economic development officers or anybody, it doesn't make sense to use my time to meet with somebody who just wants to build a little duplex, right? What's the payoff for me really babysitting somebody and holding their hand and helping them create a better project, right? There is one, but it's so small compared to the hour I could spend with somebody who wants to build something that's worth $25 million instead of $250,000, right? I have an opportunity cost to my time as a public servant, and I'm obligated to spend it well. But if I can help my community set up a system where it's easy for somebody to build a duplex if they have the right parcel in the right place and follow the rules, if there can be rules that we all agree are right, if it can be easy to get that loan, it means I don't have to meet with somebody who's going to build a duplex anymore. And what I'm going to show you in a second will prove to you that if you can create that system, for instance, 100 duplexes is worth more to your city than 200 apartment units on a mega project, in real dollars, in real dollars. What I'm about to show you, these case studies, are meant to drive home this idea, this value proposition. If you can create an ecosystem for small-scale development that makes it easy, that makes it convenient, and the market starts performing it, you get something that's a little bit more resilient in terms of tax revenues and in terms of social networks, but especially in terms of tax revenues. In a recession, if a 100-unit apartment project fails, that's a huge deal. That's property values depressed all around. If a duplex fails, it's just one duplex. Something that you can roll with. Right? There's this idea of risk and resiliency that's inherent to small-scale stuff. It's why, in the last recession, downtown survived, where people were paying attention and keeping up their investments in them. And why stuff on the edges started to flounder and took a while to come back. It's because the small middle stuff is just more resilient. It can handle these kinds of ups and downs and bumps in the road. So let's look at some of these case studies. I'm going to show you 3 examples of development from the same community. This is Duncanville, Texas. It's not too far from here. It's not on the coast. And it's not a one-to-one comparison in terms of market to market and what kind of rents they're going to get or what the construction is going to cost, but it's similar enough to draw some conclusions. So I'm going to show you these 2 projects at the top, which were done by one of our founding members. His name is Monty Anderson. And then I'm going to show you this Costco at the bottom. Now these are on the same street. This is Main Street in Duncanville. Duncanville is a suburb of Dallas. It's in South Dallas. If you know anything about the Dallas metro, North Dallas is very white, very affluent, very taken care of. The infrastructure is gold standard. South Dallas is a part of the metro that nobody has hope in anymore, or hasn't for a long time. They have hope now because of some of the incredible projects that Monty has done and what's happened in the Bishop Arts District with Build a Better Block. Monty made a commitment to this place more than 30 years ago. He said, I love this place and it needs me and I'm never going to leave it. I'm going to do projects until I'm done with life. And so he's been able to make his community better. It didn't all make sense at first, but it made sense in the long term. And anyway, I'm going to show you 2 of his projects. Here's the first one, 212 North Main Street. It's not a building that's going to win any awards, but it's occupied. It's not vacant. It's not blighted. That counts for a lot. It's in the game. Here's the before picture. This is the after picture. He's put a wall right down the middle. So now he's got 2 storefronts. And if you look at that top right image, you look closely at that, you'll see that there are 4 meters on the back. That's because on the bottom you'll see there's actually a residence in the back of each one of those storefronts. Because it's the same play that I told you earlier. Monty ran that play, put a residence in the back. It's used the exact same way. by the owners of these businesses while they were getting started, and then later for supplemental revenue. That's not the kind of kitchen I want in the apartment that I could live in today. I have more income than I did when I had to live in places like that. But there was a time in my life where I needed that, and it was the only thing that I could have. If I didn't have that, I probably wouldn't be here today. I probably wouldn't get to do a lot of the other stuff that I get to do in my career. This was real important for Main Street whenever he did it. Here's the second project. This one did win awards. I'm kidding. I like to say very diplomatically that these are modest buildings. Here's the after. Same play on the bottom. Another wall makes that into 2 offices, and then he added 2 apartments on the top. This faces an alley. This is an alley, and the Main Street's on the other side. Just adding housing to downtown where he could with what he already had in the portfolio. This is a decision based on the means of his accounts, not on the scale he had to achieve to justify it. And you did see the difference, an economy of means and an economy of scale. Here's a third project. This is where we're going to get into some of the numbers. This is a Duncanville Costco. This is a developer's dream, or at least not the kind of developer I am, but a conventional developer's dream. It's a 17-acre parcel, almost 17 acres. It's adjacent to an interstate with more than 60,000 vehicles per day. It's all already aggregated into one parcel. I only have to talk to one property owner to control this land and start executing my development. And on all 3 sides, except for the interstate, of course, the 3 other sides have already been built. The pavement's fresh. The lanes are wide. There's 4 or 5 lanes. There's street lights that look brand new. The water and sewer is new. It's all reliable. And the assessor valued this 150,000 square foot building at $8 million. Not too shabby. That works out to about $500,000 per acre. Here's the first project of Monty's I showed you, 212 North Main. That's not even 1/10 of an acre. It's got about 50 feet of frontage or a little less. The same assessor valued it at $500,000. It's a 3,500 square foot building. That works out to about $6 million per acre. I'm going to show you the next one right away and then the punchline. Here's 111 East Davis. $650,000 by the same assessor, or about $4 million per acre. This has about 70 feet of frontage. That's 70 feet of utilities and infrastructure to maintain. That's 50 feet of utilities and infrastructure to maintain. That's 3/4 of a mile of utilities and infrastructure to maintain. How many of these could I fit on this site? I'd only have to build 16 of them to achieve the same value. I could probably fit 200 of them on there. So this isn't about the Costco being bad. This is about the net revenue being better. This is different. This is about managing both sides of the revenue and expenses, not just the revenue side. We see this math everywhere we go. Everywhere we go. This is my project in Fayetteville, Arkansas. I should replace this image because we've been open for more than a year. We put a 10,000 square foot building on a 9,400 square foot site. Our assessor valued it at $1.6 million, or about $8 million per acre. We see this everywhere we go. Here's a map that illustrates this. This is by our colleague Joe Minicozy at Urban 3. This is Lafayette, Louisiana. What you're looking at here, for the business people in the room, this is a profit and loss graphic for every parcel in Lafayette, Louisiana. If it's green, it means that the revenue from that parcel exceeds the infrastructure expenses associated with that parcel. The taller it is, the more it exceeds it. If it's red, it means it's in the red. And if it's tall and red, it means that the infrastructure costs a lot more than the revenue it's bringing in. Now, I know some of you are thinking, well, what about sales tax? It's just about property tax. And that's a great question. You know, Costco, that's a sales tax behemoth, right? Here's the thing, though. If your business plan for your community is to lose money on all your residential projects, that's 90% of your community. That means your business plan is to lose money on 90% of your land and make it all up on the last 10%. That is a loss leader strategy. It's probably not going to work out in the long term. You're also assuming that people are going to buy more stuff if it's in a big format. But I don't use more toilet paper just because it comes in a bigger package. I don't eat more food just because it comes in bulk. Now, if I can only buy a BMW at the only BMW dealership in the region and it's in your community, okay, I'll grant you that. That's a total win. Those are sales taxes only you can get. But for all the regular consumer goods, it's a total wash. The format is irrelevant. I'm going to buy the same amount of stuff. I'm going to buy the same amount of clothes, whatever it is. Unless it's something that's completely unique to you, the sales tax is a wash. And to ignore that and then to double down and say that's where all of our revenue is going to get made up, that's a decision that makes you a little bit more bankrupt 1 year at a time. This looks a little familiar maybe. There's downtown Kansas City, Missouri, right there in the center of the screen at the bottom. You see if you march up the right-hand side, the next set of blue spikes is Westport and the plaza. This was done by Joe Minicozy at Urban 3 as well. This little spike, that's Brookside. Out here, sports complex. The lesson here is that there's a certain pattern that earns more. And it's real simple. Stuff has to be closer together. I don't mean stacked on top of one another. I don't mean giant buildings. You don't have to be downtown Kansas City, Missouri to have net revenue that's positive. It's enough to be a little bit more like downtown Overland Park, which also, I'm certain of it, though we haven't done the math, I'm certain has net positive revenue. This idea of things being closer together, earning more money, is real simple. And if you're skeptical, I'll challenge you to just do this. Imagine you take your kids to a baseball tournament and you want to go out for pizza when it's over. Do you go to the place that's closer or the place that's farther away? It's that simple. It's human behavior, right? When stuff's a little bit closer together, you end up using it more. You end up doing more in those places. And the fundamental principle of these economic analyses, the fundamental principle of our urban economies themselves, is that human activity is what generates transactions. They don't just happen in a vacuum, right? They happen in places. And when the places are just a little bit closer together, and especially if they're designed to facilitate these kinds of interactions, you get incredible value out of it. This kind of value wasn't there before these places were built. There's nothing about this location that says it's more valuable, except for that there's other stuff around it. If you look at Westport, it's not that Westport was more valuable before there were any buildings there, and that's why people went to it. It's that the seed got planted, and the next thing got built, and it was one step at a time, and all of that is what has created the value that it has today. So it's a decision to build in these patterns. It's a decision you can make. And once you make that decision, you'll see the value, not the other way around. You can't sit around and wait for it. It doesn't come like that. It comes when you make it happen. Let's talk a little bit about what that means. I'm going to talk a little bit about urban design, and I'm going to try to couch this all in terms of the financial stuff. We'll start with the real basics. Buildings have fronts and backs, right? The fronts are real special. They're real special. And the reason they're special is because they're owned a little bit by everybody. I don't mean that everybody in the city has title to the storefront. I mean that culturally, in our souls, we all own a little bit of the fronts of buildings, right? It's part of our identity for our community and for us as individuals based on where we live. Backs, on the other hand, can be way more utilitarian. Fronts are special for other reasons, especially in terms of the economics. If I do a project and I do a really crappy storefront or an ugly building, does that inspire somebody to do better than me? It probably inspires people to see if they can beat me on costs. Right? There's a race to the bottom effect. If I do something that's incredibly beautiful, do I inspire people to try and outcompete me on costs? Yeah, sure, maybe a few. Mostly I'm going to inspire people to outcompete me on the beauty. So if you've targeted a street, like in Vision Metcalf, for instance, and you let something come in that's really ugly, or a use that is completely inappropriate, or a use that is even just neutral, what does that inspire? What kind of follow-on projects does it inspire? And I don't have an answer for that, but it's a question that's open and that you should ask yourself with everything that comes in. What is this going to inspire among other people? And that's why fronts are really special. The rest of the building doesn't matter so much. What about this? This is a front that is trying to do absolutely everything. My dad always told me, if you're going to do anything at all, pick one thing and do it right. This is something that does about 10 things not quite right. It's probably the case that this is the only way these buildings could be built according to the rules that were in this municipality. So it's not really the developer's fault. It's the system's fault. Neighborhoods that are revenue positive like this really do have lessons for us, and they exist everywhere. It might take a little bit of time, but it's relatively trivial for an assessor to collaborate with a GIS department and come up with this kind of analysis. And when you do that, you can look at the various neighborhoods and you can say, okay, this one's revenue positive and this one isn't. What are the characteristics of both? And let's try to emulate one and not the other. Here's an example of a building that ticks all the planning boxes, but doesn't tick any of the urban design boxes. It's on a corner. Corners are the most precious parcels we have in a neighborhood, and the only thing this building does relative to the neighborhood is provide shelter for warm bodies. It doesn't do anything to make the street more productive or to inspire uplifting developments around it. We call that extractive instead of productive. Even though it may very well be the case that it's revenue positive on its own, it could do more if it was addressing the common ownership element of the project. I'm going to show you some examples of things that are probably illegal, like this fourplex. Now, if that fourplex only had one door and one mailbox on it, you could still let the same number of people live there as if it was a fourplex. But suddenly we've added 3 kitchens and it's illegal. I'm not saying every fourplex is the same, but this one would fit in our historic district in Fayetteville. And I saw a few streets today it would fit in on. You wouldn't even notice it unless you were the kind of person that went around like me and counted mailboxes. What about cottage courts? These cottage courts are so brilliant. Let me tell you why. This is a residential code building. No sprinklers required. So is this and this and this. This is built under the single family code rules. This could be a very large parcel, and we could let people who are friends move in here together. Each one of these, if you had the right rules, could be divided up for a fee simple sale. They fit in with a neighborhood of single-family homes because they're single-family themselves. This is about the most affordable format that can be constructed in America today because it threads the needle on every single code. But it's also illegal almost everywhere you go. These things make the best Airbnbs too. Like if you're ever traveling, look for the bungalow courts. Here's another example of a cottage court. This one has more units, right? This one had 4 units. This one has 27 units. We're not showing the full plan here. This is in Ocean Springs, Mississippi. This is by another colleague, Bruce Toller. There's something interesting about this project that you don't notice when you look at it until it gets pointed out. There's only 2 different buildings in this whole development. 2. The purple ones and the blue ones. The 2-story ones and the 1-story ones. Every single one of them is unique because they have different railings, they have different porches, different roofs, different colors. There are kind of 2 kinds of sameness, right? We all make fun of the sameness where you're in a subdivision and it's like the 80s and they're singing that song about ticky-tackies. Everybody's making fun of the subdivisions. That's one kind of sameness. There's another kind of sameness. There's a sameness that's good. Have you ever noticed that every main street you go to in America looks the same and we find it charming? Have you ever heard anybody go to Paris and come back and say, I'm never going again, all the buildings are the same? Right? They all are the same. All the main streets are the same. But they're the same in a way that's very familiar, in a way that's very charming, in a way that's comforting. There's 2 kinds of sameness. We've outlawed this kind. Look at this one. Now these buildings, again, aren't going to really win any awards, but they're perfectly capable. They could do for a little refresh. But this shared drive in the middle, that maximizes the tax revenue returns of both parcels. Because if I had to put a driveway in there for both of them, both of these buildings would have to be smaller. Each one would lose about 500 square feet. These are illegal in most places too. Even, for some reason cities look at this and they say, well, that's going to cause problems. Yeah, maybe it will cause problems between neighbors. But why do you have to solve it? It's like neighbors can work some things out for themselves. We should re-legalize stuff like this because it makes for more tax revenue for our cities. And it doesn't really hurt anybody. If you don't want to live in a house that has a shared driveway like this, buy another house. It's that simple. If you don't want to live in a neighborhood like this, live in a different neighborhood. If you don't want to live in a 700 square foot apartment that you have to share with a roommate, don't. But if you need to, you should get the option. These kinds of arrangements can really be incredibly, not just economically productive, but social. I'm sure we can each of us in the room can think of some example, if we rack our memories, of real pleasant, bricked up apartment buildings that have this incredible forecourt in the front. But almost all the time when apartment complexes get built, you'll see 3 times as many buildings and they'll be arranged every different way. And there's always kind of like a green Band-Aid, a green space Band-Aid, or a detention pond or something like that right in the middle, or the landscaping buffer that is supposed to fix everything that's wrong with the project. There's actually other ways of building this stuff that makes our neighborhoods better on their own. But they're illegal in most places. This is a house with another unit behind it. And this one is smaller than this one, so we call it accessory to the primary dwelling. Without a doubt, accessory dwelling units are the least expensive to build, the fastest to get in the ground and finished, and they fit in the neighborhoods we have the best. And why is that? Because they go in the backyard. Because you can add another unit to a street and you never even have to see it. Is there any kind of density that is more gentle than a backyard unit? I don't think there is, right? These are also illegal almost everywhere. In Overland Park, you don't even have a process to get special permission in very specific circumstances to do one of these. There is no condition where you can do one of these. Maybe in the downtown area, I don't remember for certain, but we heard today that we didn't think there was one. These used to be everywhere. One of the best places I've ever been to look at accessory dwelling units is Lafayette Square in St. Louis. If you ever spent time in St. Louis, or you're going to St. Louis soon, you got to go to Lafayette Square. It was a square, is a parkland square with townhouses on all four sides. And back in the 80s, they were completely run down. They were being squatted in by punks, people having band practice. It was a nightmare for the city. Somebody moved in and started rehabbing it, then somebody else did. They inspired more people. Now it's one of the most wealthy subdivisions or areas in the whole city. And almost every single one of those exceedingly grand golden era townhouses has an accessory dwelling unit on it. They actually make the neighborhood more valuable. And they make other neighborhoods more valuable too. That's more tax revenue. That's a higher sales price when this sells. That's enough revenue for my wife and I to take 2 vacations a year when my kids move out. But they're illegal. Look at that. They can fit any scale of neighborhood. Small neighborhood, these are also built as accessory dwelling units. Neighborhood with very large homes. They work a lot of different ways. And you can write codes that scale it to what is appropriate for you. I'm going to skip over this stuff. This is the rub with all of these things. There is a tremendous layer cake of all these codes. All of them. That's why big outfits hire a team of land use lawyers to figure this stuff out. It's why we're here, is to try and is to try to figure out what these things have in common, what the common missing gaps are, and figure out a way that we can fill in that's appropriate for you and that honors forward OP. We haven't even touched financing. I'll give you a little taste though. So we all know about getting money from friends and family, you know, like the loan from your uncle that you're sure you're going to pay back someday. There's residential mortgages, there's commercial mortgages. Did you know that if you're doing an apartment project that's all residential, that you go to the bank to get a commercial loan? I'm sure all the bankers know that. In fact, the threshold is 5 units. If you're building 5 units or more, regardless of format, that's a commercial loan. You build in a subdivision, that's a commercial loan. Did you know that according to the feds, if you build 1 to 4 units, regardless of format, they could be 4 cottages on a single site, they could be a 4-plex with 4 units, it could be a triplex with an accessory dwelling unit, 4 units or less, whatever it is, that the feds call that a house. In the underwriting guidelines for residential mortgages, that's called a house. They treat it just like a house. It's kind of confusing. It doesn't have to be. But it's why building the ecosystem for small-scale development becomes so critical. You just can't figure this stuff out and make a living of it and be successful and not get burnt out unless you have help. And it's not help in terms of a mentor. Everybody needs mentors. I mean help in terms of a whole system that gets set up for you. You know, there are actual financial products and pipelines on Wall Street to bundle up single-family houses and resell the loans. There are actual financial pipelines on Wall Street to bundle up giant apartment complexes and resell them, or to bundle up strip malls and resell them. You know there's no pipeline like that to bundle up 4-plexes and resell them? It makes it really hard to get a loan for a local bank to do the first 4-plex in 40 years. There's not a system for it. It's the same in the zoning code. We have an entitlement process for 300-unit apartment complexes. We know it, we use it, we do it really well. We have an entitlement process for replatting farmland into single-family subdivisions. We know it, we do it well, we can do it with our eyes closed and our hands tied behind our backs. We don't have those processes for lot splitting a large parcel into two normal sized lots and putting a corner store on one and a duplex on the other. It seems so simple. It should be simple. This is very difficult. All right, we're going to get to the very last bit here. All this becomes real important because there are actual thresholds, right? And fundamental rule of development is if you can't get the revenue, then you shouldn't build the building. Now, there are lots of bankrupt developers who didn't honor this rule. They decided to build the buildings anyway. And the thresholds look like this. If your building has one stair, then in general, you need to get $1.25 per square foot per month. So that means if I'm building a small multifamily building and each of my units is 1,000 square feet, that I need to get $1,250 every month to pay back the bank and my investors. That's my threshold. That's my break even. If I have to do 2 stairs, it's about $1.50 or $1,500 a unit per month. If I have to put in an elevator, it's about $1,750 per unit per month. If I have to put in a podium, that's the concrete retail layer on the bottom with the apartments that are stick framed up top. If you have to do a podium, it's about $2,000 a month. A lot of our cities have rules where they say if you're going to build in the downtown, you're not even allowed to put residential on the ground floor, right? And we do that because we want vibrant, mixed-use, active retail space, right? The intent is noble. But because of the Fair Housing Act and the accessibility rules that are included in the Fair Housing Act, that zoning code rule kicks in a federal requirement for elevators. And now I have to get $1,750 per month for every unit in my building because of the zoning code. And it's real common across the country. Most planners don't read the Fair Housing Act. Most building code officials don't read the zoning and development code. I mean, nobody in most cities is talking to each other. There's not a system. You guys have already started this in Overland Park. I think you guys should be proud. For instance, today we confirmed that you guys do joint project reviews where everybody who touches a project is in the same room to review that project from concept to completion. You know, some cities don't even do that. Some cities won't even give you all the comments of what's wrong about your project until you fix the first comment they gave you. And they won't give you the third one until you fix the second one, or the fourth one until you fix the third one. It's maddening. And then if you come to find out that you have a rule that requires you to build an elevator in a market where you're just squeaking by without one, your deal's dead, right? You didn't have a system in place that enabled those kinds of projects. So you've heard this notion before, especially from architects, that form should follow function. That's not true. What's true is that form follows finance. And developers build the project that they can get the loan for. They build the project that's easy to execute. A lot of cities have this idea that, well, if we just change the regulations, then we'll change what's allowed, and we'll make what we want allowed, and we'll make it harder to do what we don't want, and that'll be it. The market's going to respond, problem solved. Wrap it up, go home. No overtime this week. But that's not true. That's not what happens. You change what's allowed. That's important. That's necessary but insufficient. Developers make decisions at the center of kind of a three-way Venn diagram. They care about what's allowed. Of course, they care about what is marketable, but they also care about what is convenient. And they're trying to hit that very tiny, small bullseye to get a project done. So on the project I did, the 3-story job that I showed you earlier, we got some apartments in there. We got a smoothie bar for the yuppies. We got a tap room for the working folks. We got a little bit of everything. There's a Cajun food truck thrown in the mix and a couple of offices. I mean, it's really a smorgasbord of urban amenities. And even though that project is successful, and even though it's exceeding expectations, okay, it's still going to be 5 years before I get another paycheck out of it. That's how tight the Venn bullseye is that you have to hit. It's very difficult to do these kinds of smaller scale projects because when one thing goes wrong, if it goes wrong to the tune of $20,000, the project is over. So you have to have a system that's set up to enable that kind of stuff or you just won't get it. So we do this kind of work with other cities. Our bread and butter is doing these one-day workshops. We usually have somewhere between 80 to 120 people in the room, every one of them interested in doing a project in their own community. And we've seen somewhere around 150 or so people actually go on to become legit small-scale developers as a result of these workshops. We maybe got 3,000 or so alumni that have been through the trainings. But we really like to work with cities that are interested in this because that's critical. Otherwise, everybody just kind of falls flat on their face. This is an image from South Bend, Indiana, where we came and did stress tests and a development simulation. And that's what we're here in Overland Park to do. And so we're going to be here 2 more times conducting what we call the stress test. And what you see there pinned up to the windows, those are site plans. Every one of those site plans has notes about what parts of their code prevent that site plan from being built. Those site plans were drawn. Well, actually, we provide paper doll cutouts of buildings and glue sticks. So this is really like kindergarten camp for development because we're dealing with planners and elected officials. I can say that because I'm both a planner and an elected official. And so they're actually creating these site plans and they're doing their own code audits. And on top of that, they're running financial pro formas. So we're training them to do all of this in the room. And we sit there in this facilitated workshop for 3 or 4 hours. They run through each one of these iterations with different zoning codes, with different sites. And at the end of it, they're just like, oh my gosh, how would anybody be able to do anything in our community? And then we ask, is that why you told us before we came that nobody ever calls you asking to do these kinds of projects? Developers are kind of savvy in general. I mean, a lot of them walk in the door and they don't really know what they're doing, but they're savvy enough to tell if what they want to do is possible. And if it's not, they don't call. They go somewhere else because it's an opportunity cost thing. Right? They're going to go where they can get stuff done because it's allowed, marketable, and convenient. That's the center of the bullseye. And so as a result of this, after we do this with the kind of technocrat group, then we do a roundtable discussion where we bring in people who have the ability to change the systems that are in place. Those are influential leaders from the community, whether they're elected or appointed, or there's somebody who is the vice president of a local bank, or they talk at the local appraisers conference, or whatever it is. We bring them in the room, and that's a roundtable discussion. So you have the people that just learn the lessons, explaining the lessons to the people who have the power to change the system. And we're not there to say, you need to change this law and this law and this law. We're there to run a facilitated workshop so that the people who have the power to change it can say to themselves, this is not possible, we see, unless we can change this law, and this law, or set up this program with the bank, or this program with whoever, and this or that. So that's what we're here to do. And I want to leave upon you an impression, and then we've got a little bit of time for questions. Way back in 2013, I had the opportunity to sit down with the county judge of Pulaski County. Pulaski County in Arkansas is the most populous county. That's where the state capital, Little Rock, is. And the county judge's name was Buddy Valines, classic Arkansas name, right? But Buddy Valines, the county judge Buddy. And I sat down for dinner with Buddy, and I never really met him before, but he was a legend. And I was having this real hard time with my city council. We have a real popular farmers market on our downtown square, super popular, like 7,000 people every Saturday. And I just wanted to close another street because people were walking back and forth. We were running out of space for vendors. I just thought it made sense. And we debated it for 8 weeks over 4 meetings at the city council. I mean, debate over closing the street, and I couldn't believe it. In the middle of that, I sat down with Buddy, and I asked Buddy, I said, Buddy, you know, he'd gotten all these huge projects done. He'd crossed the state river, negotiated pedestrian bridges with the Corps of Engineers, done all this stuff in Little Rock, intractable things that nobody could ever imagine happening. And I said, Buddy, I thought he had a silver bullet. I said, how long does it take to get this stuff done? You know, I just want to close a damn street. And he laughed at me. He laughed at me. And he says, well, Matthew, it just takes as long as it takes until you give up. And I sat on that for a long time, and I have a corollary that I want to give to you now. I call it Buddy's corollary. And Buddy's corollary is just this. If you want to provide something new for your community, like more housing options or something else, you can be the one to make that happen if you don't give up. It's that simple. It's a fundamental principle of urban development. It's a fundamental principle of taking care of our cities, of placemaking itself, right? You can be the one to make that happen, whatever idea it is, if you don't give up. And I think that's the kind of thing that you need to remember whenever having this conversation about housing, because it's so personal, because it'll be so hard, because it won't end even when you have the first victory. So that's what we're here to do. We're going to be here 2 more times. And now we've got time for maybe 1 or 2 questions. And I know there's some microphones in the back. So if you have a question about our process, you have a question or you want to challenge something that was on the slide, that's okay. This would be the time. And I might hand something off to Jennifer Settle if it's appropriate. Yeah.
Can we go back to the slide that you showed about the steps and the elevator? Oh, thank you. Several times I've heard in our community that the more high-rise, very beige apartment complexes we build, the monthly rent will start to go down because we'll have a plethora of these beautiful beige buildings in town. But your chart doesn't substantiate that, because for the developer to get the return on their investment, they're gonna, if they have a podium, they're gonna have to charge $2 a square foot to get the return on their investment. So the prices aren't gonna go down as we continue to build these, or if they do go down, then the developer and the investors aren't gonna make their money, so these things are gonna get boarded up.
Yeah. Great question. And I want to caution anybody about using this slide to address anything that's really complex. It's definitely a simplification. But there is, I think, a simple answer, and that's just this. A lot of developers take a haircut on projects because they got it wrong. And sometimes a lot of people in a system can get it wrong because everybody's reading the same development reports or the same market demand reports. Everybody's looking at the same vacancy and occupancy reports coming out of the same brokerage houses. And it's a rush to get to market first, right? And most of the time what happens is you end up with a real lumpy or really spiky market year to year, where you have a lot of units delivered and then a lot fewer units delivered and then a lot of units delivered, and there's this kind of cycle every 2 or 3 years or 4 or 5, whatever the cycle is for your community. And what happens is if they can't make the rent, somebody takes a haircut. And that happens a lot. That happens a lot. And it's why we're so careful whenever we train developers, because developers can go bankrupt and so can you. There's no such thing as an old, bold developer, right? And usually what happens is those projects get recapitalized. So what that means is that they take the entire capital stack and all the ownership percentages and they reorganize them by booting somebody out. Usually the developer, and oftentimes the lender, who's in the best position, will require the person who funded the project to put in more money. And that's how they get saved. And it's not the case that necessarily that the developer just waits it out. Most of the time what they'll end up doing is lowering rents and trying to raise them later.
Can I ask a follow-up?
Yeah, sure.
Who survives a recession better? Does a smaller developer, which you gave us several examples of, or a large development like this? And then now I'll put the mic back.
I think it's really location dependent, and it also depends on where they are in their own pipeline when the recession hits. So across the country, you can look at a lot of think tank analysis on this, show that downtowns and what we call compact neighborhoods held their value, or some of them even increased in value during the last recession, and stuff that was a little bit more spread out took a real hit. So that's the first part that's the location part of the answer. The part in the pipeline is if you are in a location that is kind of iffy, where it could go either way, and you're committed to executing a project like the recession hits whenever like right after the foundation concrete is cured, you're screwed. It doesn't matter how big you are. If you are at a point in the project where you can say, you know what, we spent some money on architecture and engineering and negotiating with the city, but the writing's on the wall, we're going to hold off on this. It doesn't matter what size you are, you're probably going to end up being okay. So that's a real personal question for a lot of people. Yeah, we got time for one more, I think. Yeah. I'll wait for the microphone because they wanted to record all my lisps.
I guess a general big picture question. The state of Oregon just recently basically outlawed single family zoning.
Yeah.
And I think Minneapolis has done some of the same. What's your thoughts about that?
Yeah. So there's a lot to say about the notion of eliminating single-family zoning. And I think there are pros and cons depending on which city we're talking about. I think most cities need to decide for themselves if that's where they want to head, or if they want to try to do that up front. In neither case did Oregon or Minneapolis just decide to do that out of the blue, right? There have been many other attempts. They try to take a lot of different bites out of the apple. Fundamentally, without answering your question about whether or not I think your underlying question is saying, are we going to try and do that in Overland Park? Okay, well, I went there. We're not going to try and do that in Overland Park. That's a decision for, however you guys treat this is a decision for you guys to handle. But what is a fact, and what we'll never deny because it's a fact, is that zoning that is exclusively reserved for single-family development almost always takes more money to maintain than it gives back. So it is a fact that your more productive neighborhoods and commercial districts are subsidizing your neighborhoods that are exclusively single-family. And it's up to you to decide what you want to do with that, just like it's up to you to decide what you want to do with your unrestricted revenues with respect to parks or trail development or roadways or whatever. It's a decision with consequences. Okay. Thank you, everyone. We'll hang around for a few minutes if you want to grab us. Do you want to say one more thing?
I just want to say thank you. Thank you for being here. We'll, as Matthew said, we'll be back at this. We have several stakeholder groups. This was the start of a conversation. So I hope you appreciate that. And so thank you for coming, and we look forward to continuing this. Thanks.